Hello and welcome to part 3 of my series about Daredevil Season 1. Been a while coming, I know, but I really wanted to make this one the best one I could, which is why it's taken so long. Mainly dealing with, interdimensional problems of my own, but let's just ignore that for now. As much as I can anyway. Anyway, let's continue with the best superhero show ever made. Wish my world had shows like this. The episode opens in a bowling alley where nothing seems too out of the ordinary, really, except for this guy, Healy, who appears. He wants to throw a few balls, but the place is closing up. He asks to join that guy's game, but the girl tells him that he plays privately. He walks over to speak to the guy, who tells him it's a private game. Due to Healy's persistence, he orders his bodyguards to get rid of him, but Healy dispatches them effectively and draws a gun on the man. We're then treated to where Healy got the gun, from Turk, the runner from episode 1, who we actually see receiving those guns in that episode. Another point for consistency. Woohoo! Turk assures Healy that this gun will never jam, which the gun immediately proceeds to do so, prompting Healy to kill a guy with a bowling ball to the head after a vicious fight. Turk's general incompetence as a material runner for criminals in Hell's Kitchen is established here, and if I'm jumping ahead, is actually continued in episode 1 of season 2 with the shotguns. Again, Daredevil shows itself to be obsessed with tiny little details that carry its overall consistency to a high level, allowing the viewer to really become immersed in the show's story due to its grounded nature brought about by character and world consistency, like this. As small a detail it is. The fight is brutal as hell too, the dude's elbow bones popping out in this one shot, a particularly grisly detail. Healy then hides the gun under a pinball machine after noticing the counter girl has called the police and surrenders himself. Cut to Matt sitting outside the church looking as bruised as ever. Lantham greets him and recognises him as Jack Murdoch's boy. So I was initially going to brush this off as a plot hole as to why Lantham questions Matt's identity. Surely he would know it already, and this is just a half-thought excuse for characterization and exposition. But as Matt points out in episode 1, it has been too long since his last confession, and he describes his father's occupation to Lantham as a fighter. That, plus Matt's status as a blind man, probably clued Lantham into who he was. A potential minor plot hole has been averted due to established characterization for both Matt and Lantham. It makes the show feel lived in, as though these characters are truly from the same community and have had shared experiences which deepen the world and the characters. Now the question I must ask for scrutiny's sake is, why was Matt outside the church? Surely this doesn't require an explanation, since it could be easily brushed off as Matt trying to get back in touch with his religion or something, but I want to use this as an example of how the show pays attention to detail. If we're following his character thus far, Matt is conflicted about what he's doing as a vigilante as established in episode 1's confession. And Lantham is one of 2 people that Matt can be open with, him and Claire Temple. At the end of episode 2, Matt tells Claire to go and stay somewhere else due to fear of reprisals from the Russians. So that leaves only Lantham with whom Matt can openly discuss his vigilantism with. Following this chain of character and logical consistency in the show's writing, Matt is still conflicted about his activities and Lantham is the only person he can actually talk to about it. Hopefully I'm not reading too much into this because that is some great attention to detail right there. Then we're introduced to Ben Urich. Urich is an investigative reporter for the New York Bulletin who has his own little side story going on that helps define his development throughout the season. The dialogue between him and his associate reveals what happened to Rigoletto, who was mentioned in episode 1 by Wesley, a sign that his employer's operation is brutal even to those who work within it. They established the rules, an unofficial way for a journalist to get information from someone involved in their field of investigation. In this case, organised crime. Yes, this scene is designed to tell the audience that Urich is an investigator and he has connections to the criminal underworld and to inform Urich's cautious approach to the investigation as it begins. Hard cut to Karen, who is still working as a receptionist to Nelson and Murdoch. Small interesting detail is that the bruising and redness from her attempted murder is still faintly visible on her neck. Physically, she still has not recovered fully from that experience, the wounds lingering after a long while even though the instrument has been removed. Yet another mark for attention to detail and consistency, yay. She is surprised about a letter she receives, which she hides in her purse from Foggy when he enters. He remarks about regretting drinking the eel, referring to their last encounter. Some more character building dialogue that strengthens their bond before Matt walks in. Whereupon they remark on his bruised face and comment that he should get a dog. Matt can't respond to this perfectly logical statement. Seriously, Matt, dogs are perfect even when they're not helping you physically navigate the world, because there's a chap at the door. It's Wesley! Time for the plot to kick in. After some dialogue, when Matt asks his name, tensions immediately arise. Matt is suspicious due to the fact they are a small firm, which Foggy dismisses as he has been written in the past few episodes to just really want clients. Wesley tells him all his client wants them to do is to be ethical and decent, and quiet. for which he pays them a large sum of money. Foggy immediately accepts, which he has been written to do so, but Matt's stubbornness creates more tension, which is stronger as Wesley reveals he knows more about the firm than he's letting on, specifically about Karen. They are then given the case involving Healy, and Wesley leaves, but Matt follows him by the sound of his watch. He was likely listening to it after the Karen stuff came up. In the brief little moment Wesley gets in the car, you can see some cufflinks that look a little too familiar. Very brief, but it's there. The first thing we see of Wesley's employer is his cufflinks. Interesting. Matt also reveals his injury that occurred in the previous episode is bleeding, reaffirming his vulnerability. When Foggy interviews Healy, it's clear that this is not the first time Healy has been in this situation before. He creeps Foggy out before Matt comes in to take the case. Between scenes, they don't get anything out of him, but Matt points out the strangeness of a successful investment company receiving the case of a person charged with murder. Matt pushes Healy on Wesley, and all Healy tells them is that his check will clear. Another cool detail is that Matt explicitly says to Foggy to cash the check, even though they both know that it was probably gotten with questionable means. The scene is done, and we're back with Ben Urich, who's having difficulties over the phone when his boss walks in. Urich is frustrated about having to write about the colour of railway lines when he knows there's more going on than he's not being allowed to talk about it. Urich is motivated by the story, Ellison is motivated by sales. An interesting parallel to Matt and Foggy themselves. One motivated to do good for society, the other to make money. But this show makes both sides understandable. Ellison making the point that everyone they know is much more successful writing online, and that Ben would make it worse for them by writing about this. Then we catch up with Karen, who is put in a conundrum about the events of the previous few episodes. She's told to not talk about what happened, otherwise the company will lawyer up against her, which she claims isn't fair, but the guy does give a decent excuse as to why this could happen. More complicated shades of morality, and we're not even halfway through the season yet. Urich is then shown to be in discussion with the head of the hospital about what we can assume is his wife. This is what he was having difficulties with. A decent little piece of characterization that also allows the show to continue with its love of show don't tell. Urich didn't explicitly say that she was his wife, we can just assume that from the dialogue. Nor did anyone say that she had impaired cognitive functions, we just get a little remark from a nurse that hints at it in a realistic way. Mwah! Masterful. Then we're back with Matt and Foggy. Matt says they should pull up section 3515 of the penal and add their facts to the CJI, the Criminal Jury Instructions and Statute. It's, lawyery guff, but I actually looked up what these terms were and found them to make sense in a criminal trial prelude. Well, in your dimension anyway. More detail! They then make commentary on the Wi-Fi, which further leads to consistent characterization between Matt and Foggy. Foggy stating they should win cases and make money, and Matt reiterating it isn't all about that. I gotta be honest with you, it's kind of unbearable how consistent these characters are. We're then shown the trial and Foggy makes an impassioned opening speech. Not only are we told he graduated cum laude, but we're shown it in the same episode. Yay! Matt listens to the heartbeats of the jury and takes note when one person's goes faster when Wesley enters the room. Matt can't turn to see him, so he hears the watch instead. Small setup, small payoff, and it works magically. Matt realizes there's more to this case than either he or Foggy knows. After interrogating a guy for info on the women they have dirt on, Matt tells him to make that dirt disappear. The dialogue hints that the rabbit hole goes a little bit deeper than what Matt knows about. He wants a name, but the guy doesn't know. Based on his abilities of deduction thus far, he likely heard the guy's heartbeat and knew he wasn't lying. Also because he was in a lot of pain. That armbar looks business. Also because he explains that he's someone else's job. He likely only gets given something to do by a total stranger. Matt asks for a name, probably because he realizes how deep this goes and wants to know the name of the rabbit at the end. Now we come to Matt's closing argument. He takes his time, a moment of silence to listen to the jurors' heartbeats, then proceeds. He claims he is conflicted about morality, which has been shown to us by his interactions with Lantum. But he states that only the facts matter here, which have already been established in the show's dialogue and events. A man is dead, and Healy killed him. But his arguments actually come up strong. I mean, Healy was pleasant in the interactions with the women, and she only saw the fight after she came out from the back, so it makes sense that she wouldn't know very much. He foreshadows his coming confrontation with Healy, and the speech ends. Hell of a speech. The next scene between Wesley and Leland shows that tensions are rising still between factions of his employer's empire. Leland wants it all done quickly, but Wesley points out logically that they've left a trail of corpses and they would be caught if they did that. Instead, this must be done by the book, which is why they've hired Nelson and Murdoch. Because they are clean, unlike their usual attorneys, as Wesley points out. These are pretty objectively true. Trails do lead eventually, somewhere. Well, I mean, except for mine, obviously. And it does make sense to hire two individuals totally removed from your organization in order to keep any sniffer dogs away. Don't ask me how I know this, I just do. Anyway, moving on. The following interaction between Karen and Daniel Fisher's wife is really quite heartbreaking, honestly. She reveals she told Danny to do something about the idea that the numbers at work didn't seem right, referring to Karen's comments from episode 1. She feels guilty and took the money offered to her in the same offer they gave to Karen. From this interaction, it's clear she's just defeated and wants to move on and protect her kids. Considering the path that she's been on, feeling responsible for the death of her husband and knowing that powerful forces did it and would do the same to her family, her path is logical. So is Karen's, and I can't say I'd really blame her for signing either, even though in a black and white world I'd totally be on Karen's side. Another win for complicated morality. Karen is undeterred, however, and goes to Ben Urich to talk about Union Allied. Her goals and Ben's align, now and for the rest of the show, but both will go about investigating in very different ways. Back in the courtroom, Wesley's watch comes back and Matt realizes the fast heartbeat of another individual in the jury. Wesley came here to observe them and to make sure they follow his employer's orders. A hung jury. Healy is released. What follows not long after is a bad-ass fight. Healy holds his own decently well but is taken down by Matt's skills. However, not before we get a couple more little details. The way Healy grabs both a pipe and a glass shard shows his skills with more than one type of weapon, highlighting his skills as a contract killer, and the way the scene shows Matt's powers. The shard's noises when it scrapes across the ground when picked up by Healy are emphasised slightly, and the sharpness of the fence protrusion is highlighted by the intense screeching sound in the score. Now we come to the reveal of who hired Matt and Foggy. Healy gives up his name after Matt stabs him in the neck. Fisk. Wilson Fisk. Matt then warns Healy to get out of the city, and Healy reveals that Fisk will find him and make an example out of him and everyone he cares about. He then calls Matt a coward, and impales his own head on the fence protrusion. Now, why did Healy give up Fisk's name when he knows what would happen to him? Was it out of fear of Matt? Or fear of death? But if that's the case, then surely he knows what would happen to him if he gave up Fisk's name anyway. I'm not sure, honestly. This is probably the first scene that I'll say is more expositional than anything else, and also serves to remove Healy from the show altogether, but it also serves to highlight how feared a figure Fisk is. It also lets Matt know what he's up against. The final scene has Fisk in an art gallery gazing at an art piece. When questioned by the curator on how it makes him feel, he replies, "It makes him feel alone." I mean, Vanessa's question could honestly be applied to most media discussion channels on YouTube right now. All that matters is how it makes somebody feel rather than how well made or well presented or well constructed it is, which I actually find quite funny. And the episode is over. A fantastically crafted third episode in a series that has already 2 incredibly made preceding episodes. Rabbit in a Snowstorm serves to show us the depth of the criminal underworld and also serves as the last step before Matt learns about Wilson Fisk. There's more lawyering in this episode as opposed to Cutman, which was really only about the vigilante, but it helps break up the pace of the season and stops us getting all actioned out by episode 3. Ben Urich's introduction reveals his motivations, even though he only becomes linked to the core squad by the episode's end. So many little details, as I've mentioned before, serve to ground the show, make it believable. The natural dialogue grounds it even further, and we get our intro to the big bad boy. We're aware of Fisk's empire before the episode, we're shown its depth throughout the episode, and we see Fisk at the very end of the episode, a sort of 3-act structure in a way. Again, we're aware that the show is obsessed with these little details, making sure everything lines up and makes sense given the characters and the situations. All these things, big or small, contribute to why Daredevil episode 3 is a masterpiece. Sorry I kept you waiting. Things have been pretty stressful on my end. Dimensional obligations getting in the way, what have you. I'm trying to get these parts done though, they just take time, especially considering the detail I'm going into. But regardless of any dimensional obligations getting in the way, which hopefully should happen less and less as my technology improves, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.